And I compose film scores, not the thunderous crescendos that rattle stadium walls, but the subtle harmonies that slip beneath your skin and seep into your bones when you least expect them. On that morning, the pale winter light slanting through the tall windows of my studio caught the dust motes drifting above the piano keys, and I remember how everything felt suspended, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Clara stood in the doorway, her tall silhouette outlined by the doorframe, shoulders squared in a way that spoke of finality. I heard the click of her heels against the hardwood floor before she spoke. "I can't live on promises, Alistair. I need results." She wore that expression I'd come to know too well, polite, firm, resolute. Behind her, Isla clutched Clara's hand, her small fingers wrapped tight around the fabric of Clara's coat. Isla's eyes were wide, vulnerable pools of confusion, and I wanted to reach out and scoop her into my arms, but Clara's gaze cut me off. I watched Isla's bonnet slip from her curls as Clara's grip tightened. In that moment, I realized this wasn't an argument I could win. Clara had already decided that my dream of composing honorable, meaningful music wasn't enough to support the life she envisioned, a life defined by upward mobility, corner offices at Sterling Bank, and the steady hum of recognition. My climate documentary scores might have won heartfelt praise at small festivals, but they brought neither bank accounts flush with zeros nor the respect of high-flying financial circles. I didn't fight. There was a strange calm in that acceptance, the same calm you find at the end of a long exhale. Instead of standing my ground, I stepped aside, offering Clara and Isla the path she wanted, clear and unobstructed. I watched as Clara crossed the room, gathering Isla against her coat, and felt something break inside me. Not resentment or rage, but grief so sharp I tasted copper. She turned back once, her face impassive. "I'll take care of her," she said. Then they were gone, their footsteps dwindling down the hall until the only sound left was the echo of Clara's words and the soft tap of my heart beating in my chest. I stood alone in the middle of my studio, surrounded by the instruments that had been my refuge. Organ pipes mounted on the wall, a collection of vintage synthesizers, and the grand piano whose keys I knew by memory. The silence pressed in on me. I ran a hand through my hair and came to the piano, lowering myself onto the bench. My fingertips hovered over the ivory keys, and I played a single chord, a low, resonant minor third that trembled through the air. It felt like the beginning of a requiem. I needed to record something, anything, to anchor myself to the moment. So I began to compose, a series of slow, melancholy motifs punctuated by sudden surges of hope, the emotional paradox of heartbreak. As the melody unfolded, I remembered how Clara and I used to talk about our futures. She saw herself in glass towers, drafting financial strategies and leaving her mark on corporate balance sheets. I saw myself beside her sometimes, scoring her triumphs, but I never imagined that my success would hinge on gold-plated spreadsheets. Composing was my truth, an honesty I couldn't monetize the way Clara wanted. The irony stung. I had given my all to create beauty for other people's stories, yet I failed to write a reassuring narrative for the life I shared with Clara. But as the chords flowed, I felt a flicker of something else, resolve. I would keep composing, because that was what I knew. The hours slipped by unnoticed. I lost track of time as I layered strings beneath piano, wove in subtle woodwinds, and let a solo cello carry the heart of the piece. When the final note faded, the clock on the wall read past midnight, and the city lights outside glowed like distant constellations. In that moment, I realized two things. First, that I was exhausted, bone-tired from the emotional weight of the day, and second, that I felt strangely alive. Clara might have taken our home, our shared life, and the stable facade she'd built around us, but she couldn't take away my music. My compositions were mine alone, product of years spent listening to the hush before dawn and translating it into sound. I saved the score under a new file name, Opus for Loss. The title felt too grandiose, but it held the truth of my emotions better than any words I could speak. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, listening to the silence that had returned. In that quiet, I heard Isla's laughter from years ago, the sound of her tiny fingers tapping piano keys beside mine. I thought of Clara's steady gaze, her unbending certainty, and I allowed myself a small smile. She had walked out the door, but in doing so, she had set me free. Free to compose without compromise, to pursue every note that resonated in my soul. And so I began again, no longer the husband whose worth was measured by promises unfulfilled, but the composer whose only promise was to music itself. The house, the friends, even the familiarity of shared history could fade, but the melodies I created would endure. I stood and stretched, then walked to the window and looked out at the city that never truly sleeps. Somewhere out there, people listen to my work without knowing my name, allowing my music to become the soundtrack of their own moments, quiet and profound. Clara's departure hurt me more than I cared to admit, but as the night settled around me, I felt something else stir, hope, like a single note suspended in the air, waiting to blossom into a symphony. After the divorce, I traded our spacious brownstone in Brooklyn Heights for a cramped one-bedroom loft in downtown, an industrial relic with exposed brick, lofty ceilings, and windows so tall they framed the skyline like a living painting. The space barely held my grand piano. Its lid scraped the metal ductwork whenever I opened it more than an inch. But I didn't mind the squeeze, because in that narrow room, the silence breathed around me, clearing my head in ways the hollow echo of an empty house never could. Sleeping on a futon at the foot of the piano, I learned to distinguish between the rhythms of my own breathing and the distant wail of sirens on Clinton Street. At 2 in the morning, when the city rattled its pipes, I would unlatch the piano lid and coax minor chords until the tumult outside faded into something resembling peace. Clara, by contrast, ascended the ranks at Sterling Bank with a precision that left no room for doubt. I saw the occasional headline in the Wall Street Journal: Sterling Bank names Clara Gage Regional Vice President, or Rising Star at Sterling Bank poised for CFO role. With every promotion, I imagined her stepping into bigger boardrooms and flashing a steely smile at colleagues who didn't know her beyond her polished title. She was living the conventional success story I'd always thought I'd share, only it had a different co-author now. As for our daughter, Isla, she oscillated between those worlds. Weekend visits in my loft, where she learned to draw musical notes beside my sheet staves, and weekdays in Clara's pristine townhouse, where she traded those sketches for algebra worksheets and etiquette lessons. Each return to my place felt like stepping back into a half-remembered dream. Papers stained with coffee ringlets, the faint scent of pencil shavings in the air, and chords from my latest piece humming in the background. Isla would perch on the edge of the piano bench and ask, "Daddy, what does this part mean?" I'd smile and say, "It means we're still here, finding our way." My turning point arrived unexpectedly, like a note I didn't know I'd written. I composed the score for an independent film called Broken Rhythm, an intimate documentary about drifters seeking purpose in an America that had moved on without them. The director, a young woman with a constellation of freckles and an unshakable conviction, told me she needed music that felt like home even when you were lost. I worked 20 hours a day for weeks, layering piano arpeggios with distant horns, weaving in subtle percussion that mimicked the pulse of heartbeats and subway wheels. When the film premiered at Sundance, the audience sat in hushed darkness, and as the credits rolled, the credits lingered on my name, Alistair Gage, composer. My heart thundered with pride. The buzz spread. Indie festivals in Toronto, Berlin, and can build Broken Rhythm as the film that resonated because of its soul-stirring soundtrack. Then came the call I'd dreamed of in secret, an invitation to attend the Academy Awards. I flew to Los Angeles, wearing a rented tuxedo that felt like a costume and perched on a stool backstage, waiting for my moment. When they announced Best Original Score and I stepped onto the stage, the lights flattened me into a silhouette. My voice trembled as I thanked my collaborators, my family, Clara and Isla, though Clara wasn't there, in the city that had taught me to hear beauty in broken things. Outside, paparazzi flashes exploded like fireworks, and I realized how far from that one-bedroom loft I'd come. The Oscar changed everything, though I kept my life as unchanged as possible. I returned to Brooklyn and signed the deed to a new studio space. An airy room facing the East River, complete with windows so wide you could watch the sunrise over Manhattan Bridge. I founded Gage Music Collective, a small but fiercely dedicated group of composers, sound engineers, and orchestral arrangers. Our first contracts brought in 7 figures. By the end of the year, I'd crossed 8. I answered invoices in crisp black numbers, wired payments to myself, and felt a thrill at watching my bank balance climb. Yet I never changed the way I composed, the way I spent nights at the piano arranging violin sections or coaxing electronic pulses out of a synthesizer. The money was a byproduct, not the goal. Through it all, Clara never called. No congratulatory text after the Oscar, no envelope embossed with Sterling's logo and an invitation to speak at a bank luncheon, no request to revise her favorite lullaby theme for Isla. I wondered if she saw my success as a betrayal, a tacit rebuke to everything she had sacrificed. When we divorced, she took the house and most of our mutual friends, Now she had my daughter's weekends and a corner office. I had applause from strangers and the hum of a thriving collective. Neither path was perfect, but it was ours, divided. Isla celebrated my triumphs in her own way. She learned to say, "That's my dad," when reflected in screenshots, and on our visits, she'd wander through the new studio, pressing buttons on the mixing console and peering into soundproof booths. Once, she coaxed a timpanist playing a test beat to let her tap along, giggling as the vibrations rattled the floor. I watched her and recalled when she was small enough to nestle in my arms and drift to sleep as I improvised bedtime melodies. She had grown into a young woman with her own dreams, her own rhythms to discover. And so my life settled into its new cadence. Mornings spent reviewing contracts and mentoring junior composers. Afternoons at the piano or perched in front of a computer monitor editing orchestral tracks. Evenings alone in the loft, sipping black coffee and writing new themes until dawn. The loft had become my sanctuary and my workshop. The silence that once felt like emptiness was now a canvas for creation. Clara's voice lingered in memory, sometimes like a distant chord that didn't resolve, but I no longer felt wounded by it. Instead, I felt gratitude for the quiet spaces where I heard my own muse, for the daughter who reminded me to keep dreaming, and for the unexpected film that changed everything. In the solitude of that loft, with the piano's black silhouette against the window, I realized success wasn't a destination but a composition, built note by note, crescendo by crescendo, through persistence and passion. Clara had walked out the door when I wasn't yet ready, and maybe that was the only way I became the composer I needed to be. As the city lights shimmered beyond the glass and the distant rumble of traffic became a low bass line, I sat at the piano, placed my fingers on the keys, and began to play a new piece. The melody rose gently, full of possibility, and I understood that the long silence had led me here, to this moment of harmony. The morning the silver-embossed envelope arrived, I was up before dawn, working on a string quartet that hummed with restless longing. The curve of my mailbox overlooked the East River rippling in the weak light, and inside the envelope lay a single card, heavy, cool to the touch, and embossed with cursive so elegant it might have been written by hand. My name was printed on the front, Alistair Gage. I hesitated before breaking the seal, as though I could spare myself the sting of memory. Inside, the invitation gleamed. Clara Gage and Griffin Vance request your presence at their wedding celebration, Saturday, May 16th, 6 o'clock in the evening, the Metropolitan Club, Manhattan. I set the card on the piano and let my gaze drift to the windows, where the rising sun painted the sky with strands of pink and gold. I imagined Isla's face as she opened her own invitation, her mixture of delight and hesitation. She would celebrate her mother's new beginning, I knew, and I wanted to be there for her, even if every detail reminded me of what I had lost and what I had built anew in the intervening years. The Metropolitan Club, pristine marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and waiters in white gloves. Clara had once called that place a shrine to success, and now she would exchange vows there with a man whose reputation for venture capitalism was matched only by his polished over personality. I folded the card carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Later, when Isla came to visit, I handed it to her. Her eyes flicked up at me, measuring the weight of the invitation in her hand. "You going?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I want to be there for you," I replied. She tucked the card into her purse and smiled, but there was something in her gaze, something vulnerable yet courageous, that reminded me of who she had become, my daughter, straddling two worlds with grace and grit. That evening, I prepared for the wedding as though I were composing a piece of music. I tried on jackets until I found one navy enough to feel formal but not austere, polished my shoes until they caught the lamplight, and rehearsed a courteous smile in the bathroom mirror. I practiced calm, steady breathing, reminding myself that every chord of anxiety could be transformed into something beautiful if I chose to write it differently. Before I left, I paused at the piano, played a single chord, and whispered, "This one's for you." The Metropolitan Club came into view as I turned off Fifth Avenue, towering stone facade, heavy wooden doors carved with artful swirls. I stepped inside to a hushed lobby of marble floors and echoing hallways, where I felt simultaneously out of place and inexplicably at home, the paradox of every composer who walks through the corridors of grandeur bearing a melody born from quiet rooms. I signed in at the reception desk, collected my place card, and followed a string of guests into the grand ballroom. The rooftop party was already in full swing by the time I arrived. Orchids and blush tones spilled across low tables, and white-gloved waiters navigated the crowd with trays of champagne flutes that caught the skyline's glow. Soft laughter spiraled into the night air as guests mingled beneath twinkling lights, the Hudson River a dark ribbon beyond the glass barriers. Clara stood near the bar, resplendent in an ivory gown that fell like liquid satin, her hair swept into an intricate chignon. Griffin Vance arrived beside her, his tailored suit cut with surgical precision, a smile that gleamed too brightly to be entirely genuine. Isla ran toward me, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She wore a champagne-colored dress that matched her mother's gown palette, and her curls bounced as she threw her arms around me. "Daddy, you came," she said, her voice brimming with relief. I hugged her tight, feeling the slender outline of her growing frame against me. "I wouldn't miss this," I said. She looked past me at Clara and Griffin. "Mom told Griffin the first was having him escorted," she whispered with a grin. "He doesn't know about the Oscar," she added conspiratorially. "He thinks you're a piano tutor." I chuckled, surrendering to the warmth of her secret. "I compose," I said, stepping around her. Griffin approached then, extending a firm hand. His handshake was smooth, almost too smooth, and his grip measured. "You must be Alistair," he said with forced amiability. "Clara tells me you dabble in music." I met his gaze calmly. "I compose film scores," I replied, offering a smile that carried more sincerity than any business handshake he could produce. Clara hovered just behind him, her lips curved in what I assumed was encouragement. "He's written a few scores," she interjected quickly. She watched my reaction as she downplayed my achievements, and in that instant, I recognized the beginning of a performance 2 decades in the making. Her life of clean lines and controlled narratives pitted against my world of restless inspiration. I glanced back at Isla, whose eyes shone with mischief. Griffin leaned closer, his breath faintly scented with cologne and ambition. "I hope you'll forgive me if I can't afford an Oscar," he whispered, voice low enough that only I could hear. The slur of the remark was swift, but the point landed like an arrow. I raised an eyebrow and held his gaze. "I think you'll find there are things more precious than awards," I said, voice steady. A waiter offered us champagne, and I accepted a flute, feeling its cool stem catch between my fingers. Clara smiled, unaware of the tension curdling beneath the surface. I lifted the glass and nodded politely. "To new beginnings," I said, the words carrying more weight for me than anyone in that crowd could understand. Griffin echoed the toast with forced brightness, and Clara's eyes flickered with something I couldn't read: regret, apprehension, or perhaps the faintest edge of nostalgia. As the night wore on, I drifted among clusters of guests, collecting congratulatory murmurs and polite laughter. Yet my focus remained on the interplay between Clara and Griffin, their practiced smiles, their shared whispers, the occasional glance they shot my way as though testing how far I'd come. Musicologists at the party debated the merits of silence and sound. Investment bankers speculated on Sterling Bank's next move, and I, Alistair Gage, composer of quiet scores, stood in the midst of noise I had once thought deafening. By the time the string quartet struck up the wedding march, I felt an unexpected calm. The melodies rose, and Clara walked down the aisle toward Griffin, every step measured, every note of the quartet underscoring her carefully curated confidence. I watched Isla's hand tighten around mine before the ceremony began, and in that moment, I realized that this invitation wasn't just a reminder of past losses, it was a testimony to how far we had both traveled. I raised my glass again as the music swelled, determined to honor not the performance Clara had scripted, but the authentic composition we each carried in our hearts. The rooftop terrace was a vision of modern opulence, a bleached marble floor overlooking Manhattan's glittering sprawl, with strings of warm lights crisscrossing overhead like constellations. White-gloved waiters moved through clusters of guests, offering trays of champagne and tall flutes and canapes that tasted as delicate as porcelain. Imported orchids and blush and ivory cascaded from low tables, their petals so flawless they seemed sculpted. A gentle breeze carried the distant hum of traffic and the faint chime of the East River Ferry's horn. I stepped onto the terrace and felt the air shift, as if I'd entered a world built entirely on appearances. Isla appeared beside me in a swirl of champagne silk, her curls bouncing as she soared toward my side. She wrapped her arms around me with a fierce hug. "Dad, you made it," she said, voice bright with relief. Her eyes sparkled with pride, and for a moment, I felt less like a guest and more like a father whose presence had earned small domestic victory. Wouldn't miss it for the world, I replied, kissing the top of her head. She smelled of jasmine and fresh anticipation, so different from the anxious scent of my own nerves. She glanced around conspiratorially. Griffin doesn't know about your Oscar, she whispered. He thinks you're a piano tutor. I suppressed a chuckle and placed a hand over hers. I compose film scores, I said softly. Her grin widened. Exactly. We navigated the gathering crowd, Isla's arm looped through mine, until we found Clara and Griffin near the bar. Clara's gown shimmered in the light, the fabric hugging her figure just enough to suggest elegance without ostentation. Griffin stood beside her, a carefully chiseled presence in a suit tailored to knife-edge perfection. He raised a glass to us, his smile polite but distant. I lifted my own glass in return, noticing the faint smudge of lipstick on its rim, a small flaw in the tableau of perfection. Isla's looks very grown up, Griffin said, voice smooth as polished stone. He extended his hand toward me in introduction. I took it and felt the cool firmness of his grip. His palm was slightly clammy, betraying the practiced calm of his public persona. She's my world, I said, offering a polite smile. Clara hovered behind us in a way that suggested both pride and caution, her posture immaculate, her expression a mask of poised contentment. I watched the way her gaze flitted from Griffin's confident stance to Isla's eager face, then to mine, and wondered what thoughts flickered behind her composed exterior. A string quartet began playing nearby, a lilting version of Pachelbel's canon, and guests turned toward the makeshift aisle. Clara slipped off her champagne flute and rested both hands at her waist. Griffin cleared his throat and guided her toward the center of the terrace, where an officiant waited with a small podium adorned in white roses. The quartet's melody swelled, and I felt a hush descend over the gathering, an unspoken invitation to witness the union. Isla slipped her hand into mine, her small fingers trembling slightly. Remember, she whispered, this is your scene too. I nodded, settling into the role of silent observer, heart thrumming in time with the music. The vows began, Clara's voice steady, Griffin's deep tone resonant, each word delivered with precision. I noticed the subtle exchange of glances between them, the practiced synchronicity born of shared ambition more than romance. As Clara spoke of love and partnership, I thought back to the doorway of my old studio when she said she needed results, not promises. In that moment, I recognized how different our definitions of partnership had become. When Griffin declared, I promise to provide stability, to protect and cherish, I felt a familiar tension coil inside me. It was the same tension I'd felt when I watched him hand Isla the invitation card with a veneer of warmth that masked possessiveness. I resisted the urge to stand and interrupt, to remind him that provision isn't measured only in financial terms, but in devotion to art and understanding a child's heartbeat beneath a violin solo. As Clara repeated her own promises to support his ambitions, to stand by him through every venture, I caught a glimmer of regret in her eyes, quick as a shudder. Perhaps she sensed the dissonance between their scripted declarations and the chords of authenticity that lay beneath. Because mere seconds later, when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the quartet shifted into a triumphant march, Clara's smile faltered before she lifted her face to his for the kiss. The applause rang out like 1,000 cymbals crashing, and I let myself be swept up in the movement of celebration. Champagne flutes clinked, and guests rose from their seats to offer whispered congratulations. I watched Clara step away from Griffin and wave at her guests, her grace unmarred, but I could still see the fleeting ripple of something unsettled. Later, I found myself at the edge of the terrace overlooking the city lights, the moon pooling silver across the skyscrapers. My glass felt heavy in my hand. Griffin joined me, leaning against the stone balustrade. He offered me a half-smile. "Enjoying the view?" he asked. I looked out at the horizon and then back at him. "It's beautiful," I said. "But sometimes it's the unseen notes that make the music worth hearing." He glanced at me, brow lifting. Unseen notes. I took a sip of champagne and met his gaze. Yes, those moments of truth that happened between the lines. My words landed between us, an unspoken challenge. He stiffened, then tilted his head and nodded. Interesting perspective from a piano tutor. I set down my glass and faced him fully. The city lights danced across his sharp features, casting them in relief. "I compose film scores," I said, voice calm but firm. "Sometimes they win Oscars." His eyes narrowed for the briefest instant before he masked it with a polite smile. "Well, congratulations," he said. "I'm sure your work is remarkable." I nodded and turned back to the skyline, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. Isla's laughter drifted from inside as she tapped her own rhythms on the marble floor with a friend. Clara's voice rose in cheerful conversation with family members. And somewhere beyond the balcony, the Hudson whispered its steady current. In that moment, I realized that this rooftop, so perfect in its veneer, was built on lies as carefully arranged as a false chord. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, the truth always found its way through the seams. I picked up my champagne glass, raised it toward the city, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold tang on my tongue reminded me that authenticity, once tasted, is impossible to unhear, like a melody that lingers long after the performance ends. They seated me at a small round table tucked into a corner near the ladies' room, a strategic spot that felt more like exile than hospitality. The linen tablecloth was stiff and starched, embroidered with an intricate pattern of golden vines that caught the chandelier's glare. My wine glass, still half full of muted burgundy, bore a faint smear of crimson lipstick at its rim, a silent testament to some previous guests' hurried departure. The scent of roses, imported, I imagined, mingled with the sharper tang of alcohol and perfume, creating a heady bouquet that roiled in my chest with each breath. I inhaled slowly, reminding myself that this evening was as much about patience as it was about performance. Jason Mercer, Clara's younger brother and one of the few allies I still had in this family drama, slid into the seat beside me. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that looked comfortable only because he'd owned it for years. His grin was amused, conspiratorial, like someone who knows the secret punchline to a joke no one else has heard. "Griffin's been bragging about her upgrading," he whispered, nodding toward the center of the ballroom where Clara and Griffin laughed among a cluster of admirers. His voice was low and wry, a dry sarcasm that spoke volumes. "He says she's finally trading up, from a starving artist to a serious financier's trophy wife." I lifted my glass and took a measured sip, letting the scotch's warmth spread through my veins. I didn't respond to Jason because there was nothing to say. Words were unnecessary when the atmosphere itself carried the barbs. The clink of silverware on porcelain, the hushed conversations, the swell of background music. All provided a soundtrack more piercing than the most trenchant critique. Around me, guests raised their glasses, murmured congratulations, and leaned into the clipped notes of the string quartet. Yet the tension radiating from Griffin's table seemed to pulse in time with the music, an undercurrent of menace beneath polite applause. I studied my reflection in the polished surface of the table's brass center ornament. In the candlelight, my face looked both calm and hollow-eyed, as though sculpted by experience rather than youth. I traced the faint lines around my eyes, the kind that deepen when laughter and sorrow mix, and wondered how Clara would react if she saw me now. Would she regret trading our shared imperfections for this sterile veneer of success? Or would she remain blind to the fact that authentic emotion cannot be airbrushed away? A waiter approached and refilled my glass with unspoken discretion. I nodded in thanks, feeling the level of wine settle around the stem. My gaze drifted across the room to Griffin, who had slipped onto the small dais erected for speeches. The quartet finished their piece, and the room's ambient noise dipped as guests turned their attention to him. Griffin lifted the microphone, his posture straight-backed and confident. For a moment his lips pressed together, like the edge of a knife, and then he began. He cleared his throat, a soft but deliberate sound, and raised his glass. "To my beautiful bride," he said, voice smooth and practiced. "Clara, you have been the guiding star of my life." Polite laughter rippled around him, and he paused, allowing the flattery to settle. "But tonight," he continued, "I want to toast something more than beauty. I want to toast substance. Because in my world, substance is built on stability and numbers, not on fantasies that chase rainbows and vanish at the first sign of hardship." A tremor of outrage flickered through the crowd, so faint that it might have been imagined. Before polite applause followed, I felt the heat creep up my neck as I watched Griffin's gaze lock onto mine, his eyes narrowing just enough to make it personal. "Some men stay stuck in dreams," he said, voice low but audible. "They chase melodies or paint pictures, hoping that someday the world will catch up to their illusions. But real men, men who build futures, choose foundations over fancies." He raised his glass again, a mocking echo of his earlier flourish. "To foundations," he declared. Silence stretched for a heartbeat, then polite clapping filled the ballroom. Guests cheered, lifting their glasses in unison. I held my breath, resisting the urge to hurl my chair across the dance floor. Instead, I took a slow sip of my scotch, tasting the bitter oak and the faint smoke of peat. The warmth soothed the sting of humiliation, reminding me that I had built my own foundation. One of quiet persistence, of notes that resonated in empty theaters and in the hearts of strangers who never knew my face. Jason leaned over, voice low. "He means you," he said, nodding at Griffin's still-raised glass. His tone was both sympathy and defiance. "But he doesn't know the half of it." I offered him a tight smile, appreciating his loyalty. And yet I understood. Loyalty to what? To a family fractured by ambition? To memories of a life that no longer existed? My loyalty lay with the music I composed, the only constant in a world of shifting alliances. The quartet began their next piece, a gentle waltz that felt ill-suited to the electric tension in the air. I watched Clara standing beside Griffin, her hand on his arm, her eyes glinting with embarrassment or anger. I couldn't tell which. In that moment, she looked like a queen whose crown itched on her head, a facade cracking under the weight of spindly expectations. I wanted to reach out, to remind her that she once loved the half-light of my studio where chords meandered like rivers, not the spotlight glare where every imperfection was magnified. But I stayed rooted in my seat, a spectator to her undoing. When the music swelled, I took a final sip and set the glass down with quiet resolve. The clatter of forks against plates, the rustle of silk and taffeta, the subdued hum of conversation, they all blended into a cacophony of background noise that no amount of composition could tame. Yet in that clamor, I heard a solitary note, a single, unwavering tone that rose above the rest. It was the resonance of truth, that art, emotion, and authenticity endure when hollow promises and power plays fade into silence. I stood, smoothing the lapel of my jacket, and caught Jason's eye. He rose with me, offering a brief nod of solidarity. Together, we stepped away from the table, leaving behind the lipstick-stained glass and the strings of forced laughter. The room's noise closed in behind us, but I carried the clarity of that single note forward, an anchor in a world that tried to drown out honesty with its own clamor. And as I moved toward the center of the ballroom, ready for whatever came next, I understood that sometimes the most profound music is born from the space between sounds, the hush that follows a storm of applause. Later, as the hushed laughter and clinking glasses swirled around me like a half-remembered dream, I slipped away from the main ballroom and made my way toward the bar. The marble floor underfoot gleamed in the soft light, and the acrid scent of spilled spirits mingled with the sweet perfume of bygone roses. My pulse still throbbed from Griffin's public denouncement, his diatribe about dreamers and providers, but I had learned over the years that the only antidote to humiliation was composure. I walked with deliberate calm, shoulders back, gaze steady, until I found the polished mahogany counter and slid onto a stool. The bartender, sensing my need for discretion, poured me a neat scotch without question. I lifted the glass to my lips, savoring the burn of peat and oak. The warmth spread through me, stoking a quiet confidence. I was not the man Griffin thought me to be, the aimless dreamer lost in melodies, the kind who would wither under corporate scorn. No, I was the architect of my own fortune, the composer whose quiet persistence had yielded a seven-figure enterprise and an Oscar trophy resting on my studio shelf. Griffin had no inkling of the portfolio I built in the shadows, estate holdings, royalty rights, production revenue, money that flowed into my accounts like a steady river no banker could dam. I was lost in these thoughts when I sensed someone approach. I turned slightly and saw Griffin's sharp silhouette materialize beside me. His tailored suit fit him like armor, and his posture was rigid with controlled aggression. He studied me for a moment, as though considering which of my vulnerabilities to strike next. Then he leaned in close, so that only I could hear. "You've had your time," he said, voice low and insistent. "Let Clara move on. Why don't you cut ties with my wife?" The possessiveness in his words grated against me more than the arrogance ever could. "My wife," I echoed softly, letting the question hang between us. His jaw clenched. "You know what I mean," he snapped, wiping a drip of condensation from his glass. "You and Clara, your chapter is over. Monday, make it official. Cut ties. Stop confusing Isla." I studied his eyes, cold and calculating. In that gaze, I saw everything I'd left behind. My small studio, sandwiched between record shops and coffee kiosks. The early mornings spent alone at the piano, coaxing fragile harmonies into bloom. The night spent wiring payment confirmations to gauge music collectives' accounts. Griffin assumed I was adrift, waiting for Clara's forgiveness, hoping for reconciliation. If only he knew. I set my glass on the bar and nodded once, crisply. "You're right," I said, voice quiet but firm. Griffin's eyes widened for an instant, a flicker of triumph dancing there. "I will," I continued. He let out a breath of relief, straightening in satisfaction. "Thank you," he muttered, stepping back as though our conversation were a closed deal. He didn't notice the ghost of a smile tug at my lips. "Monday, then," he said, before turning on his heel and disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, then lifted my glass and took a long swallow. The scotch grounded me, reminded me of the ground I'd built beneath my feet. "Monday," I whispered to the empty room. The word echoed like a promise, but the promise was not to Griffin. It was to myself. My mind raced as I calculated the steps I would take once Monday dawned, a careful orchestration of financial maneuvers that would leave Sterling Bank's coffers lighter by $700 million. They would discover the withdrawal not as a trickle, but as a silent storm, leaving their balance sheet unbalanced and their coffers echoing with absence. Across the room, the string quartet struck up another tune, something airy, almost carefree. I paid it no mind. My plan needed silence, precision, the kind of subtle movement that only someone who understood the power of a single note could appreciate. I drained the rest of my scotch, set the empty glass aside, and rose from the stool. The night had shifted. I felt it in the air, charged with possibility. I straightened my jacket, draped the invitation card back into my pocket, and made my way toward the terrace. Outside, the moon cast a pale glow over the skyline, turning windows into lanterns and streets into silver ribbons. The city hummed with hidden energy, as if it sensed my resolution. I found an empty bench near the glass railing and sat, pulling my coat tighter against the slight chill. My breath misted in the air as I contemplated the future, not the future Griffin envisioned, but the one I crafted in the quiet hours, where each decision was a careful chord progression leading to a final, resonant chord. A gust of wind carried the faint echo of laughter from the party beyond, a reminder that life marched on, ignorant of the battles fought in hushed corners. I closed my eyes and centered myself on the sounds that mattered, the distant rumble of the river, the soft hum of traffic, the whisper of my own heartbeat. In that stillness, I felt the first stirrings of triumph, a quiet affirmation that sometimes you have to play a long game to win. I stood and made my way back inside, passing clusters of guests who raised curious glances as I strode past. Some offered polite nods. Others looked at me as though I carried news of calamity, perhaps sensing the tension still crackling in the air. I ignored them all, heading straight for the exit, my mind already mapping the steps I would take come Monday morning. As I crossed the threshold into the night, I pulled out my phone and composed a brief email to my financial advisor. Begin transfer protocol. Account X321 to account Gage Holdings. Total transfer, $700 million. Execute Monday 9 a.m. sharp. I paused before hitting send, savoring the calm certainty of the plan. Then I tapped the screen and sent the message. The phone buzzed in my hand, confirmation of delivery. I pocketed it and gave the city one last look, a metropolis built on deals and declarations, unaware that one man held the power to shift its currents. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets and set off down the street, each step echoing in the quiet of my own resolve. Monday would come, and with it, the transfer that would sever Griffin's illusion of ownership and reopen the door to my own narrative. The night embraced me like a symphony's final chord, complete, unassailable, and charged with promise. Dinner wound down in a haze of half-empty plates and fading laughter. The last notes of the quartet drifted through the ballroom like confetti settling after a fireworks show. I sat at my table, tracing the rim of my water glass with a fingertip, letting the cool edge remind me that I was still grounded in reality. Around me, guests exchanged gentle farewells, muted hugs, compliments on the flowers, whispers about the late hour. My gaze drifted to Clara, who stood with her back to the balcony windows, talking quietly with her mother. Her gown caught the chandelier's light, transforming the fabric into a river of ivory. I remembered the woman who once thought that chasing safety meant sacrificing her heart. I rose and approached her slowly, mindful of the hush that fell over the room as people recognized my movement. Clara's conversation with her mother paused, and she turned to me with that practiced smile, polished, polite, but not quite reaching her eyes. "Thank you for coming, Alistair," she said, voice even. I know this night wasn't easy. Her words were soft, but I heard the gentle edge of accusation hidden beneath the civility. I nodded, folding my hands in front of me. "Isla's happiness matters more than any discomfort," I replied. I watched Isla slip away, joining a circle of friends near the hors d'oeuvres table, her laughter rising and falling like a melody I used to compose. Clara's mother cleared her throat and drifted back to her own table, leaving Clara and me in a quiet pocket of the room. Her fingers flexed at her sides, as though she missed the clasp of my hand. The seconds stretched between us until Clara's voice cut through the silence. "Your daughter told me you and Griffin had a nice chat," she said, lips curving into a half-smile. "I appreciate you making the effort." Her compliment felt like a test, a way to measure how far I'd come, or how far I might still fall. I inclined my head. "Thank you for the invitation," I said. "And for including me." She studied me for a moment, eyes flickering with something unspoken. Regret, perhaps, or the faint ache of memory she'd left behind. "I never expected you to be such a presence here," she admitted. Her words were honest, brittle as spun glass. I considered her reflection in the window, the woman who once believed that stability was the only currency that mattered. "I've built a life," I said quietly. "A successful one. I didn't need to prove anything to you, Clara." My statement landed between us, charged with years of unspoken frustrations. Clara's shoulders sagged imperceptibly, as though she realized the emptiness of the promises she once embraced. Before she could reply, Griffin's voice rose in the background, calling for attention. The crowd parted as he stepped onto a small platform, lifted a glass, and cleared his throat. His posture was rigid with confidence, an actor who knew exactly when to project authority. "Friends and family," he began, voice resonant. "Tonight we celebrated love and partnership, but there's something I believe needs to be said." Murmurs rippled through the guests. I leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "We live in a world where actions speak louder than words," Griffin continued, gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on me. "And sometimes, one must choose between fantasy and reality." A hush fell. I watched Clara's face tighten. Her lip quivered for the briefest instant before she composed herself. Griffin paused, the silence swelling like a drawn-out chord. "Some people dream," he said, voice deliberately pitched low. "Others provide." His gaze met mine, unblinking, and I felt the weight of every scornful word he'd uttered that evening settle like stones in my chest. The guests applauded, uncertain cheers that brushed the edges of the room. Wine glasses tapped together and forks stilled midair. I took a breath, imagining the steady cadence of my daughter's heartbeat in the next room, the steady insistence of truth pressing against emptiness. I rose from my chair, the room's attention pivoting toward me. I lifted my glass, feeling its stem cool and reassuring between my fingers. "Well said, Griffin," I declared, voice resonant enough to carry across the hush. "And in the spirit of providing, for those of us who understand its true meaning, I have an announcement." The guests leaned forward, forks forgotten, eyes trained on the platform. Clara's lips parted in shock. "On Monday morning," I continued, voice steady, "I will be closing my $700 million account at Sterling Bank." The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it pressed against the walls, eliciting gasps and startled murmurs. I lowered my glass slowly, savoring the moment when the facade cracked. Clara's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. I met Clara's gaze, intense and unflinching. "I'm not doing this for you, Clara," I said quietly. "I'm doing it because of them." My words landed like a final note, pure and undeniable. Griffin's jaw slackened, betrayal and perhaps fear flickering in his eyes. The guests murmured, words cascading like dominoes. Clara's face went pale, her hand trembling as she reached for Griffin's arm. I turned and walked away, the echo of my footsteps marking the end of the performance. The music resumed all around me, diners picking up forks, servers refilling glasses, but in that fractured silence, I heard the sweetest chord of all, justice played on the strings of truth. Clara's champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor, the crystalline shards scattering like failed promises. The shriek of breaking glass punctured the stunned silence, and in that moment the room seemed to tilt on its axis. Guests who only seconds before had offered polite applause now gasped, hands flying to mouths, faces drained of color. Griffin's composure shattered too, his posture, once a fortress of arrogance, collapsed into disbelief. I watched him step forward, eyes blazing, but Clara's hand on his arm stopped him, her fingers trembling as though she feared he might strike me. I felt no triumph or malice in that moment, only a serene conviction that truth, once spoken, must be lived. I stepped away from the dais, each footfall resonating on the marble tiles like a drumbeat marking a turning point. The quartet's music stumbled into an awkward pause before the violinist resumed with hesitant grace, as if afraid to disturb the charged atmosphere. Clara's mother hovered at the edge of the crowd, shock etched in every line of her face, while Jason stood behind me, shoulders set like a shield. Isla, pale and wide-eyed, gripped my arm, her small frame trembling. In that instant, I realized the cost of my declaration. It was not just bank balances and reputations at stake, but our daughter's sense of security. I stooped and brushed a fragment of glass from her shoe, meeting her gaze with a steadying smile. "It's okay, Isla," I whispered. "We'll make it right." Around us, the guests began to murmur rumors. Did he just? Is she leaving him? What will Sterling Bank do? Waiters backed away with polished trays, careful to avoid disturbing the fractured stillness. Griffin stepped forward again, voice tight. "Alistair, you can't do this," he said, each word laced with equal parts anger and panic. "You'll ruin Clara's career. You'll ruin our family." I looked at Clara then, her posture rigid as though she might flee, and I remembered the day she left me, dragging Isla into a world measured by profits instead of passion. My heart clenched for her, for the years she spent chasing stability while her heart withered. But pity didn't sway me. "I'm not doing this to you, Clara," I said, voice soft but unyielding. "I'm doing it because of them." Clara's eyes glistened with tears as she drew a trembling breath. "Why didn't you ever tell me how successful you'd become?" she asked, voice breaking. "Why keep this from me?" Her words hung between us like fragile ornaments on a thin wire. I folded my hands in front of me and met her gaze with honesty I'd long withheld. "Because I didn't need to prove anything to you," I said. "I needed to prove it to myself and to our daughter." There was a raw vulnerability in that moment, an admission that success felt hollow when shared under false pretenses. A distant relative murmured, "He's right," and a few heads nodded in agreement, the tide of sympathy shifting from husband to ex-spouse. The quartet finished their hesitant performance and slipped into a low, mournful adagio that seemed fitting for the unraveling scene. Clara covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Griffin's face flushed crimson, and he looked as though he might speak again, but Jason's firm hand on his back froze him in place. Silence reclaimed the room, heavier now with the weight of unvarnished reality. I knelt beside Isla and placed an arm around her shoulders. Her cheek leaned against my chest, her tears dampening the lapel of my jacket. I stroked her hair, whispering, "You're safe. I'll always protect you." Clara lifted her head, her tear-streaked expression a mixture of regret and awakening. She took a step toward me, then stopped, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, voice small. "I was wrong to leave everything unsaid." I straightened and offered her a nod, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that we both carried our own share of blame. The guests began to disperse, some offering awkward condolences, others bending to help Clara gather her discarded glassware. Griffin stayed silent, guilt etched into his features. Outside, the night air called with cool clarity, promising a fresh page once we stepped beyond the gilded walls. Isla and I rose together, and I guided her toward the exit, each step echoing resilience. As we passed Clara and Griffin, their eyes met ours for a fleeting moment. Clara offered a shaky half-smile, and Griffin looked away, unable to meet my gaze. On the sidewalk, the city thrummed with life indifferent to our private upheaval. I leaned down and ruffled Isla's hair. "Let's go home," I said, voice tender. She nodded, her tears replaced by quiet resolve. Together, we walked into the night, leaving shattered glasses and broken illusions behind us. The future for us was uncertain, but in that uncertainty lay truth, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Isla perched on the edge of the piano bench, her legs swinging as she waited for me to speak. The afternoon light filtered through the loft's massive windows, casting golden stripes across the sheet music scattered on the floor. I sat beside her, my fingers still warm from our morning session, and watched the way her brow creased in concentration. For years, Clara had steered her toward law, a career with stability, she'd said, but after that night at the wedding, something in Isla shifted. She needed to discover her own path. "Dad," she began, voice steady, "I've been thinking." She unfolded a crisp sheet of manuscript paper, revealing the final version of her composition. The header read simply, "New Beginnings." Beneath it, a flowing melody for piano and strings wove through pauses as deliberate as a held breath. My heart thumped with pride and a flicker of worry. This was her choice, but it was uncharted territory. "I don't want to go to law school," she said, eyes bright. "I want to study music production. I want to build scores, not just argue cases." I closed my eyes and inhaled, tasting the dust and ink of the studio that had become my world. Memories of late nights wrestling with harmonies, of the rush when a film editor first played my cue, washed over me. Then I opened my eyes and looked at her, seeing the same spark I'd once seen in myself. "Isla," I said softly, "music isn't an easy road. You'll face skeptics, deadlines you can't control, moments when inspiration feels miles away. But every note you write will be yours, pure and unrepeatable." She nodded, lips pressed together, absorbing my words like chords settling into place. She reached forward and placed her fingers on the keys, playing the motif she'd written. Each note rose with clarity, carrying both vulnerability and conviction. The cello line followed, voiced on the piano by gentle arpeggios, and a soft electronic pulse hummed beneath. As the melody unfurled, I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not for the hardships she might face, but for the courage she displayed now. When the final chord lingered and faded into silence, she looked at me, breathless. "This is what I want," she said. "I need your help to make it real." I stood and walked around the piano, wrapping my arms around her shoulders. "Then let's make it real," I replied. Together we mapped out a plan: summer courses in sound design, internships at production houses, mentorships with composers I trusted. I would introduce her to my colleagues, open doors she never knew existed. And in return, she would teach me to see music through fresh ears. The way a first bloom surprises a gardener every spring. Later, as we reviewed her revised score under the soft glow of studio lamps, I realized that her choice reshaped both our futures. No longer was I just her mentor, I was her collaborator, a fellow traveler on a path defined by melody and possibility. In that quiet loft, with the city humming beyond the glass, I understood that legacy isn't measured in accolades or bank balances, but in moments like this, a father and daughter composing the next movement of their lives. Notes converging into a harmony neither could have created alone. 3 months had passed since I stood at that bank gala and made my declaration, and the city outside my studio window felt both familiar and newly open. Mornings began with the click of my metronome and the first tentative notes of a new score. Afternoons slipped away in meetings with directors, technicians, and, most exciting, Isla, who had become my trusted collaborator. Tonight, though, the loft was hushed. The last movement of my latest soundtrack lay before me, sketched in pencil across 6 staves. Every note mattered. This was not just another commission, it was the culmination of everything I'd learned about courage, authenticity, and the rhythms that shape our lives. I tapped my pencil against the desk, listening to the echo in the empty room, and let my mind drift back to the galleries backstage. Clara in the front row, eyes bright with surprise, Isla pacing in her own booth, headphones on, critiquing my mix in real time. The applause that followed was genuine and warm, a testament to the power of honesty over pretense. I closed my eyes and envisioned the film's final scene, a father and daughter walking arm in arm into the dawn, their silhouettes merging with the morning light. That image would guide the last movement, an ascending theme that began in minor keys but bloomed into a triumphant major chord. I returned to the piano and played the opening phrase, a sighing motif that hovered between melancholy and hope. My fingers found their way through the arpeggios, building tension in the middle register before climbing toward the high notes, where violins and cellos would join. As I played, I felt Isla's presence beside me, her steady breath harmonizing with each chord. In that moment, I realized the last movement wasn't just mine. It belonged to both of us. Pulling away from the piano, I arranged my notes on the stand and picked up the phone. The producer needed the demo by midnight. I pressed record on the interface and played the theme in one continuous take, letting every imperfection, every human breath and slight shift in tempo be part of the performance. When the last chord faded into silence, I exhaled fully, feeling the weight of the past year lift from my chest. This was music born of truth, of risks taken and reclaimed, of a life led by melody rather than fear. Later that evening, I joined Isla at our favorite rooftop overlook, the city's lights glinting like stars fallen to pavement. She played me the first edit, layering her own cello line over my piano theme. The two voices intertwined, weaving a tapestry of sound that spoke of journey and arrival. I watched her bow stroke after stroke, the concentration on her face mirroring my own when I first sat at that grand piano years ago. When her version ended, she looked up. "We did it," she said, her smile luminous. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pointing out at the skyline. "We did," I agreed. "And this is just the beginning." Under the night sky, we listened to our composition echo across rooftops, knowing that life's final movement is never truly final. It simply leads into the next. And as the last notes drifted into the breeze, I realized that my greatest score wasn't one I wrote alone, but the shared symphony of music, family, and the courage to follow our own rhythm.